So today I'm gonna do an apple pie tutorial, and I actually just got back from the store from grabbing some apples. I already have the flour, crisco, and all the other stuff that I need for it. So I actually am running late. I only have like a couple hours before the actual awards dessert starts for Franklin's football team. So this is gonna be a quick and easy apple pie tutorial. Nonetheless, you know, just as delicious, but if you're ever in a hurry, then bake this kind of apple pie, and also you can extend it as I'm doing to make multiple pies. So I'm using a mix of Granny Smith's and Pink Lady apples, mostly Granny Smith's, but they're both on sale at the stores, so I decided to just grab a little bit of a mix. You can use all Granny Smith's if you want, or you can use other apples that have a little more tartness to them. So I have my apples, and I'm going to use about 4 apples per pie since I'm using disposable pie tins. The disposable pie tins are just slightly smaller and shallower than like a glass or a ceramic pie pan. So anyway, I'm going to do about 4 apples per pie, and you can see I've washed the apples, and now I'm just going to peel all these apples. So you can peel apples backward like I'm doing with these long peelings here, or you can peel them forward. Doesn't really matter how you peel them. Just get those apples peeled. We're going to just use this little core slicer thing because it does speed up the process of slicing the apples into, you know, really even pieces. So you just kind of push that down and then pull up the apple slices. It's not a perfect process, but I do feel like it does make things go a little bit faster. And of course you can just use a knife to slice all the apples if you want to, but I don't own a lot of like kitchen gadget type things, but I do find that this particular one, the core and slicer for apples, does actually help. You know, some gadgets I feel like just add time and either cleanup, or, you know, they're just like unnecessary, so, or they're too expensive. But this little thing is pretty cheap and pretty helpful. So for some of the bigger apples, it might leave a little teeny bit of core piece in, you know, still in the pieces. For the smaller apples, it's pretty perfect. So you can always just cut that little extra piece out with a knife when you're done, when you're slicing the pieces. You just want to make sure that when you use this thing, you actually get it to go down evenly, like straight, so that it gets the core out. So yeah, it goes pretty quickly. I am going to just do 12 apples for 3 pies right now because I'm going to bake 3 at a time, because my oven isn't going to hold the full 6 pies. I only have 2 racks, so I could bake 4 at a time, but you know, 4 and 2, might as well just do 3 and 3. It's a more even way to divide 6. So this is a lot of apples. For 6 pies, that's 24 apples. Thanks, Langston, for screaming. But yeah, Langston's home. So my cutting board is much larger than my previous cutting boards that I've had, but still, obviously, it's not quite large enough to do this entire coring and slicing process. So I'm going to have to grab a bowl and pop some of those apple pieces into a bowl just to kind of clear off my cupboard. We'll go back through these apple slices and cut them in half again. So we're not quite done with them, but we're just trying to get them 50% sliced If you were to use this large of apple chunks, it would be a little bit too big for apple pie. So, just got 3 more. I feel kind of like a slacker to just be making apple pie, but honestly, I've just had a really busy weekend and day to day, and there's no time for making pies that need to chill or that are going to take longer to bake or longer to make or whatever. So my plan was to do sweet potato and apple, but I am just doing apple as it turns out. But they're like 80 people, so only half of the people there will even get a slice of apple pie, so it's not like it's that redundant, I guess, you know. Alright, so once you have gotten that part done, then just grab a knife and slice these guys either in half or thirds, depending on whether they're the bigger apples or the smaller apples. The smaller apples, you'll only need to cut them in half. The larger ones, you'll probably need to cut them in thirds. And if there's a little teeny bit of peel left on the end, you can just kind of, you know, whisk that off with your knife, or any other little like parts of the blossom end or anything like that. And this does really help make the slices even, because sometimes you might slack and start slicing bigger or smaller or whatever as you go if you're just slicing the apples themselves. So I do find that the little core peeler thing is helpful for keeping the slices uniform. And again, I'm using Granny Smith and Pink Lady apples. Just throwing in a few Pink Lady apples for flavor. You can use just all Granny Smiths if you want. I just don't like to be boring, so I like to mix things up a little bit and try a little different twist every time. Which means that really no 2 times that I make a recipe or a batch of whatever food are the same, because I kind of make it a little bit based on my mood, and I make it by eye. So yeah, it just turns out slightly different every time. I am not as good of a cook if I'm in a really bad mood. I tend to kind of mess things up because I put my feelings into the food a little bit. Same with art. I think that anything that, you know, any kind of creative process, it's always just best if you're in a good place. Turns out better. So that's kind of like putting a little love into the food. At the same time, if I'm stressed, not upset, but just like stressed, then sometimes cooking is a stress release for me. So I differentiate stress from being like actually mad at somebody that I'm, you know, somebody that I actually might be making the food for. That's when it doesn't turn out as good. It's like, I have an argument with Franklin and then he wants me to make dinner. Yeah, it's like, I'm not gonna feel like putting the extra touch on it. Just do like the basics, because, you know, that's how people respond when there's conflict, typically. So you always want to treat your cook well, especially before he or she is cooking for you. Have the argument at the dinner table or after the dinner table, not before dinner is made. That's my advice anyway. all done slicing up all those apples, your 12 apples. I usually get a lemon, and the apples are going to start to turn color. You want to make sure that you kind of squeeze the lemon over your hand so that you can pick out any seeds, you know, so you don't really want seeds in there. But yeah, just squeeze like both halves of the lemon, and then just kind of with your hands stir it in. Doesn't really matter if those apples oxidize a little bit and turn color because you're just putting them in a pie, but I think the lemon juice just adds a little flavor as well. So we always used to, you know, I grew up on the side of a mountain with a lot of apple trees, and we always used to make pies with the little apples that fell before they ripened. So they were like unripe apples basically, so they were sour all by themselves. But you can kind of make any apple sour by just adding a little bit of that lemon juice.
We also coincidentally had a tree that was called One Apple Bakes a Pie, and it literally was a tree that had these huge apples, and like each apple was the size of 4 or 5 apples. So one apple really did in fact bake an entire pie on that tree, but the tree only produced maybe like 10 apples a year, so it's kind of lame.
These are the things that are going to make the pie filling. You want some sugar, and probably like, I'm going to put in about, maybe that's like about a cup of the granulated sugar, to about the same amount of your brown sugar. And I'm using just light brown sugar. I feel like it makes a nice flavor. If you want to use the darker brown sugar, or even if you don't have any brown sugar, you can just add in like a little bit of molasses with your white sugar to darken it, to give just a little bit of that kind of brown sugar flavor. So brown sugar is always kind of hard to get out of the bag. So yeah, about probably like a cup of each or so in there. And then just a little bit of salt. You don't want much, just like maybe a half a teaspoon or something, you know, just to kind of add some flavor. You definitely want your cinnamon. So however cinnamony you want it, go ahead and shake in enough cinnamon to satisfy your taste buds. And then I just like to, with my hands, kind of mix that up and incorporate the brown sugar with the white sugar. The brown sugar always has kind of clumps because it has more moisture with that molasses than the white sugar. So you want to break up those clumps and make sure that it's all thoroughly incorporated. Then you're going to add some flour. So I would say, you know, like a couple tablespoons or so, or maybe 3 tablespoons of flour. Kind of stir that up with your hands. And then I also add just a little bit of cornstarch. Because I don't like straight cornstarch apple pie filling, but I also feel like just straight flour pie filling is a little bit, I don't know, just like a little bit too kind of gloppy. You just want it to look right. So I'd say that's probably about 1.5 tablespoons of the cornstarch, and then probably about 3 tablespoons of the flour, and maybe like a teaspoon of the cinnamon, half a teaspoon of salt, cup of white sugar, cup of brown sugar. So what we're gonna do is take our apples. This is obviously not enough for the entire batch. So what I'm doing is I'm just adding in this mixture and stirring with my hands. Stirring to start to get the juices kind of flowing in the apples. Then we're going to do basically the same thing all over again. So another cup or so of the white sugar and about the same of the brown sugar and the cinnamon. You can add a little ginger if you're, you know, creative. I don't actually have ginger on hand today, but it is a nice little after taste, or like a little undertone or something to the flavor, to have just a tad bit of ginger. You don't want too much ginger. I don't ever put nutmeg in apple. Some people put nutmeg in apple pie, but I just like the cinnamon. The ginger adds a little freshness to it, but yeah. So you're just gonna, once again, make sure that all the brown sugar clumps are incorporated. So for just one pie, you probably use like half a cup of white sugar and half a cup of brown sugar, and maybe like a couple tablespoons of your thickener total instead of 4. So now I'm making a mess, but such is life with cooking, right? So yeah, you just want it to look right. I know that probably means nothing to most of you, but that's what I go by. I go by eye and feel. So someday I'll have like a second person to assist with actually stepping in and measuring everything after I do it by eye. All right, so add that in. And once again, you just want to keep stirring and making sure that it feels like the right amount of your sugar, flour, cinnamon mixture to the apples. And that does feel like the right amount at this point. Basically, you want those apples to look really good and coated in that mixture, because as soon as they start to bake, that juice is going to be released and it's going to mix with all that sugar. So we're going to set this aside while we get our pie crust made. So for your pie crust, I'm just going to use that same dry ingredients bowl, and you just want to measure out enough for at least a 2 crust pie crust. I don't want to make all of my pie crust at once, because that's gonna end up making it more stiff. So you want to kind of salt the flour, mix that salt in with the flour. I like to add just a little bit of sugar to my pie crust, not much, just a sprinkle to take a little bit of the edge off. And when I'm making apple pie, I honestly add just a shake of cinnamon. It's not going to be very strong, but it's going to just pull the flavors together from the crust to the pie filling. And then we want to get our Crisco. Shortening. You can actually use butter and Crisco. You can use only butter, but I feel like the flakiness of the pie is definitely aided by Crisco. You want Crisco if you want a really flaky pie crust. And I personally do not like a stiff pie crust, so I'm going to add in about 2 scoops of Crisco and a little bit more, so it's probably like a cup or so. And then I'm just going to put in a little bit of butter, not much butter, into the pie crust, but just like, you know, a tablespoon or so. And it's fine to just use that butter right out of the fridge because we're gonna just incorporate this with a pastry blender first. So that's kind of what your pie crust looks like initially. So you want to get your pastry blender and start just cutting in the Crisco and the butter into the flour mixture. And make sure to just kind of keep it from sticking to the little wire tongs. This might look like a scary amount of Crisco, but honestly, pie crust is not supposed to be low fat. Pie crust is supposed to be flaky. So if you have pie crust that's stiff and chewy and low fat, it's just not, you know, like why even eat a pie if you're gonna have that, in my opinion. You wanna have a nice flaky pie. So you can get kind of aggressive with cutting in that shortening and butter. Where you want to be really gentle with your pie crust is as soon as you add the water, that's when you don't want to overwork your pie crust. So at this stage, you're really just cutting in that Crisco and that butter and making sure that it reaches a nice, almost like little peas or whatever. If you feel like you might have a little bit too much Crisco and butter in there, you can always add a little bit more flour. Because it should look like just little kind of flakes when you're done mixing it. There shouldn't be any like really large clumps. So it should kind of just look like this with your, once you're done cutting in all of that Crisco. So once you've cut in your shortening and butter into the pie crust, get some ice water, and you're just gonna sprinkle the ice water over the top of the flour and shortening mixture, and then just kind of toss it lightly with a fork. This is the part where you don't want to overwork it or your pie crust will be too stiff. So you kind of toss it and then add a little bit more water. You want to do this until it kind of forms like a ball that you can roll out. So as long as you're seeing little dry bits in there, you want to add a little bit more water. You don't want it to get goopy to the point where it's like sticky and wet, but you want it to make sure that you know, all of the dry parts are incorporated so that you're not ending up with extra extra dry pie dough. So you can kind of see when it's starting to gather together, and there are no more little dry sections in the bottom. Then you're going to go ahead and flour your surface. And I'm going to just wipe this down with a clean towel. And then flour. Because you want to make sure that your pie crust does not stick to your countertop. And you're gonna go ahead and get, for one crust, you should have about as much as kind of fits in your hand, almost like a softball, or almost like the size of a bigger apple. So then you can just go ahead and sprinkle some of that flour over the top and start to roll that out. And if you need more flour, of course, just add a little more flour on top to just to the point where it doesn't stick to your rolling pin. And again, these disposable pie tins are a little smaller, so get one of those. We should be about right size-wise. So to get this off of your surface, just kind of like gently roll it up like that, and then place it in the pie tin. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but the one thing that you do have to make sure of is don't overwork that crust, because if you're trying too hard to make like a perfect circle or something and you overwork it, your pie crust is going to get stiff and chewy, and nobody wants that. So you want to go for the look, the flavor and the texture right now over the looks. All right. So once you've gotten that in there, grab a little knife, whatever, or a big knife, whatever knife you can find. Trim off the crust just to the edge of the whatever pie pan you have. And again, if you have a bigger pie pan, just roll out your crust a little bit larger, of course. Just roll it out to fit your pie pan so that you've trimmed, you know, you have your pie crust just right inside of your pie pan. Then we're going to just set aside those little scraps. We're not going to use those right away because we don't want to incorporate rolled out pie dough back into the same bowl, because I'm really picky about my pie crust being tender, and that's not going to be tender once it's already rolled out. So now we go back to our big bowl of delicious apple pie filling and we're going to want to add in some big handfuls of those apples into the pie crust. So we don't want it to overflow or run out when it bakes. So that should be about enough. Like, we don't want it to be to the point where like if you heap it up too much, I mean, it looks pretty, but in reality when you bake it, if it's like way heaped up, it's going to bubble out and make a big mess, especially in these more shallow more shallow type of pie tins. Sorry, I can't talk today. I'm just like kind of in a little bit of a mental fog from having a sick kiddo the last couple days, and just, oh my gosh, it's just been a crazy long weekend and everything. So that looks good. You just want it to look about right. And then we're gonna go ahead and roll out our top pie crust. But before we actually put on the top pie crust, we are going to dot this with butter, meaning we're just going to take a little bit of butter, like about a tablespoon or so, and we're just gonna put, and this is cold butter so that you can actually break it apart into these little, what they call dots, which are just basically little small pieces of butter sprinkled over the top. And this is going to just help give it a little bit more flavor, and also it will kind of like boil down into the rest of that pie crust and the apple pie filling mixture, and just make it like super delicious. So this is what your pie should look like before you roll out your top crust. So I'm just gonna find a place in my tiny little kitchen. I have no space to set that. And then I'm gonna grab another handful of the pie crust. Okay. And we want to bring back our flour. Make sure that you have enough flour again to where it's not gonna stick. And we're gonna roll that out. And this is going to be the top pie crust for this pie. So you want to have, for a 2-crust pie, you're using basically twice as much pie filling, but that's like twice as delicious, because then you have literally like 50% pie filling and 50% pie crust when you take a bite, as opposed to like 75% pie filling and 25% pie crust. The best thing about a pie is the goodness of the crust. I mean, you might as well just make like a custard or pudding or cake or something else if you're not gonna have like a really good pie crust. So there's your pie crust, and how we're gonna get this on top of the other one is, once again, we're just gonna gently lift in the corners. And if you have any sticking, just, you know, try and carefully lift it up so that the crust doesn't tear. And just kind of roll it and smooth that out of the way. Bring back your pie, and then we're just gonna go ahead and unroll it right on top of this guy. And it should meet almost perfectly with that edge. Now, if it doesn't meet perfectly with the edge all the way around, then you can just borrow a little piece from one place and just tack it in to the area that you might need just a little extra. So once again, you just want to be sure to not overwork that crust, because you want it to be flaky and delicious. So just kind of cut it all the way around, and then comes the fun part. So some people get really into fluting the edge, you know, with a fork or with whatever, I don't know. What I do is I just very gently push it together all the way around so that it seals the pie crust underneath, and then also, you know, seals that pie crust on top together. And then once that's just pushed together all the way around, then I just take my fingers, which of course have tons of flour and everything else on them, and I just do like this. So these fingers are like pinching, and I just kind of like put those fingers together with those fingers to pinch. And again, everybody has their own little way. I just want to make sure to not overwork that crust, because you want the crust to be, again, flaky. It's not a sculpture project. It is a cooking project. So you want, first and foremost, the flavor and the texture, all that stuff to be the best. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and with the same knife that you've been using for the edges, just go ahead and cut a little slit in the middle a little slit in front of it, a little slit behind it, and then like out to the side. So you're kind of making a little bit of a pattern, whatever kind of pattern you want to make. It's not a huge deal, but the point of this is to let the apple pie bubble. It gives it a little bit of oxygen in there and airflow, and will help your pie bake perfectly. So this is what it looks like when you put it into the oven. Some people are going to brush the tops of their pies with like egg whites and all this other stuff. I like just a nice solid basic pie crust, so I don't do any of that extra like putting sugar on it and everything else. So we're going to pop it into a preheated 400-degree oven. So this is what your pie should look like before you put it into the oven. And we're going to cook it for half of the time at 400 for like 20 minutes or so, 15-20 minutes, and then cover it with aluminum foil and cook it for another 20 minutes on 350 or 375. So when you're done with the pies and they're in the oven, you are definitely going to want to clean your workstation. It might look something like this. Instead of getting a wet washcloth, grab a plastic type of spatula and just scrape the cupboard first, because that pie crust is just going, and all that flour and stuff is going to just kind of like grab onto a washcloth, and it's just going to make like a bigger mess. So I always just scrape my surface first with this, and then just kind of like gather that flour into a pile. Now if you want, if you have a sifter, you can sift it through your sifter to save the flour, but this is really just a small amount of flour. So what I'm going to do is just grab my garbage can and just kind of like lean it up against the edge of the counter, and then just kind of sweep that in. And so then it's just like, it's just so much easier to clean up now with a wet washcloth than it would have been, you know, beforehand. So you can just, now you can just basically wipe your surface clean. So yeah, that's just kind of like one little tip to scrape, because otherwise you end up with a lot of these things, these little pieces of pie crust that are kind of stuck to the counter, and they're just hard to get off. So if you can get most of them scraped off first, and then you can go ahead and just clean your surface down. So I did decide to go ahead and bake the 4 pies together instead of 3 and 3. So once your pies start to get a little bit of browning on the crust, those top 2 are, and maybe this one isn't quite, because that's the last one I put in. Then you're going to want to put a little bit of aluminum foil. You do the aluminum foil just around the edges of the crust, or you can kind of make these like little tents and just form them so that they protect the crust from getting overly browned. So when the pies are all the way done, take them out and just cool them on the counter. You can see that my pies did in fact run over on the edges, so I did fill them a little bit too full still. I was trying not to, but honestly that little bit of pie filling that runs over the edge actually tastes really amazing. It just kind of is a headache to clean out of your oven, but it is kind of like a caramely flavor. So these will be super delicious, and I cannot wait to dive in and try one. So as a little side note, even though I did overfill the pies a little bit, I had pie filling left over. So I actually ended up making 4 pies out of that amount that I had in the large bowl. I did have to slice another apple and a half or so just to stretch it for that 4th pie. But if I hadn't overfilled them, it would have been actually a perfect amount for 4 pies. So for the little small tins, the disposable tins, you might only need like actually 3 apples per pie if you have those nice big apples. So just wanted to kind of like clarify that if anybody's wondering how I got 4 pies in this mix.
So I did this the 4 pies, and instead of 6 actually, because I had to make like 4 to 6 pies. So then I already had 4. So then I figured might as well just go with that. So yeah, they turned out great. And now I'm going to slice into one just to show you what it looks like on the inside. So when I cut the pie, I always follow the first center slit with the knife and just cut out from there, and then cut, into a wedge on the other side. You can see that on the inside of this pie, there is a little bit of oozing because it's still very warm. The pie is still hot, but it looks like the pie is definitely thickened just the right amount, because if it was not thick enough, it would just like run all over the plate and just ooze all the way out. So there's just a tiny little bit of oozing, which is just perfect for the warmth of the pie, how it is right now. This pie is so delicious. This first piece is just like gone in seconds. So yeah, it's great with whipped cream. It's great with vanilla ice cream. You can just eat it by itself with a cup of tea, but you'll definitely be cutting in to get a second piece right away. And once again, it's so good to eat warm. It's just a shame if your pie filling is too thin and you have to wait for it to cool all the way off to get it thick enough to slice. It's nice when it's thick enough to slice while it's still warm, so you can just, dive in and eat that warm apple pie and have it sliced out in nice pieces to serve. So this crust is also extremely flaky. It's very delicate. So be careful when you serve it, not to be too aggressive with serving it, like just kind of carefully lift it up and out. And set it on the plate, and yeah, it's very delicious, and I think you're gonna love it. So let me know if you do end up making this apple pie. Let me know how it goes and if you have any questions.